Behind me is a 2006 GMC Envoy Denali. If you have an oil pan leak or you need to replace your oil pan gasket or the whole oil pan on a 2002 through 2009 Chevy Trailblazer, GMC Envoy, Saab 97X, Buick Rainier, Oldsmobile Bravada, Isuzu Ascender, with a 5.3 and it's four-wheel drive, this video is for you. If you have the Atlas inline 6-cylinder engine, it's probably going to be pretty close to the same procedure, so you can follow along on this, make adjustments as you need. But anyway, I got a few drops of oil every time I stop overnight, and confirmed it's the oil pan gasket. So I'm going to go through the steps of taking the pan off and replacing that gasket. There's a lot of videos out there on replacing the gasket on the LS out of the Chevy Silverado 1500. It's a different process. The truck has the front axle separate from the pan. You still got to pull it down, but it's separate from the pan in front of it. This in the four-wheel drive on these vehicles, the axle goes through the oil pan. So there we go. I've already done the a couple preparation steps, taking both wheels off, jacking the car up, putting it on jack stands, and removing the negative battery terminal cable down here, 8mm bolt to pull that off. I know, like everything you do with cars, the first step is, hey, remove the negative battery cable. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. It's important for this job because you're going to be pulling the starter out, and of course, you know, you got that main positive lead going down to the starter. You don't want that touching the frame when you pull that out, so pull the negative battery cable for this job. So the next step is to pull the dipstick out, the bolt that I'm shining the flashlight on. You pull that bolt out, and then you should be able to pull the whole dipstick tube out. Alright, there it is. That's as far as I'm going to pull it out. You just need to break it loose. That was a 15mm bolt that you had to pull out up top. Alright, next step. Well, of course the next step in the procedure was to jack it up and remove the wheels, but that's already done. Next step is to pull this engine protection shield. You got 13mm bolts. Looks like we got 4 of them. I'm going to do that and get back with you. Alright, there it is. It's off. Just pulled it off and slid it back there. I do this a lot. When I take these bolts out, I just thread them back in. Any bolt I take out, I just thread back in a few threads. I'll be doing that a lot throughout this video. Rather than bagging and tagging bolts, it's just easier. Throw them right back in the hole where they came from. Next step, drain the oil. Alright, there it is. Oil's draining. The next step, while that's draining, I'll just show you. It says to drain the front differential. So I'll take the gear oil out of that next. Okay, after you've got the front axle differential drained and the oil drained, the next step is to remove the front propeller shaft, otherwise known as the drive shaft for the front. I'll be taking these bolts out of here from the U-joint, and you notice here I've marked it. I've made a silver mark there and there, so when I put it back together, I know exactly where it went. Don't have to do that. It's just a good practice with balance and all that stuff. Here's your first good look at my oil leak. It's here on the front axle, molded aluminum piece here that bolts to the oil pan. As you get back further, you can see all these drops here. That's the problem. I confirmed it wasn't the rear main seal by pulling the torque converter inspection cover. That looks all nice and dry in there. It's literally coming from up top there and making its way down to the transmission bell housing there. So anyway, gonna pull the drive shaft here. Alright, it's out of its location, just so you know that those are 11mm bolts. I'm used to drive shafts being able to push into the yoke, being able to be pushed into, you know, the transfer case or the rear differential, wherever it might be, or the transmission tail shaft. This one's pretty tight, so I'm gonna let it sit there for now, and once I get some more stuff out of the way, I'll probably end up taping these bearings on. Those caps come off and you get the needles all over the place. That's a real pain in the butt. You basically have to replace your U-joint then. So anyway, I'm gonna leave it there for now. Remember that it's there, and yeah, I'll tackle that later. Let's move on to the next step. The next step is to remove the anti-lock brake wiring harness from its retainers. So they're there. I think that's it on this, but on both sides, I'm just going to show, you know, just this one side. You just pull these clips out and let it lay loose. The reason we're doing that is this whole assembly is going to end up getting disconnected from here and pulled outwards, so we can get the drive shaft out of the differential. All right, that's loose. So there was 3 clips total. One right here, one right here on the upper control arm, and one back here on the frame. And you can see now I've got this whole harness just dangling loose. Next step is to remove the brake flex line. It's these couple bolts right here, maybe even that one there, but that's a hard line. But anyway, I'm going to remove these 2 bolts and make this flex hose as loose as possible. Okay, all those bolts are loose, bracket's loose, the wiring harness is loose. I ended up pulling that bolt here against the frame, even though that this is a hard line. It's nice and loose. It's what the GM procedure says to do, so you know what the heck, it's right there. I did it. Next step is to remove the axle's differential vent hose. But before I do that, just a quick reminder, I think this goes without saying, you do this on both sides. You're going to have to pull both of the spindles down. Alright, I'm opting just to loosen the vent hose from its connection up top. This is it right here. It's really on there on the axle, the little nipple that the hose presses onto on the differential. So I don't want to rip the hose and mess with all that. So the axle is not coming all the way out. It's just going to be moved off to the side down in there. So I'm just going to undo this clip, which has already been done, and just kind of pull it out here. Just let it dangle there loosely. That way it'll have room to move around and won't stretch itself out. Like I was mentioning earlier, this whole piece has to come down at an angle towards you to get the axle out. So after getting that vent hose disconnected, remove these pinch bolts from the upper ball joints, both sides. Alright, there they are, removed. The next step is to remove the retaining nuts for the strut up top. So just these guys right here, that one and that one. Don't touch the middle one. Both sides. I have opted to put a jack underneath the lower ball joint, so when I remove those retaining nuts, I can lower the whole assembly in a controlled manner. Alright, after you get the strut tower bolts loose that you did up top there, the next step, or not just loose, you got to take the nuts off. The next step is to remove the stabilizer link from the frame here. 21 millimeter, and if you look in the end here, it's really hard to see. See a hex in there? So if you just try to put a socket on this thing, it's just going to spin on you. So wrench on the nut here and counter hold it with a Allen hex right in here. Alright, so once you get those out, just bend them up out of the way. Basically, you just don't want the stabilizer connected to the lower control arm. As it's lowered down, it'll impede it from going down. So I already did the passenger side, but I haven't gotten to the driver's side yet, so I'll just kind of show you what's going to happen. Again, these bolts that were up top here, don't do the center one. Your spring will shoot out on you. The 2 outer bolts just from the frame, or nuts rather. You get this pinch bolt out, which is 15 millimeter. Don't know if I mentioned that. You can tap in a wedge into here and get that control arm up and off the ball joint. So with that loose, I'll show you over here on the passenger side. Here it is lowered down. You got the strut assembly out of its home up there. The upper control arm is just kind of right here. Yeah. Brake line's still pretty darn loose. That's good. ABS line or electrical is loose. As you can see here, this axle boot now is nice and tight. All right, so what we're going to do next is remove the axle out of the, well, this side isn't the diff, but it's clipped in. You just kind of have to hammer it out up there. All right, there the axle is removed. So just to get that out, all I did was, you know, I came up from here with a, not a pry bar, but basically a 3/8 extension that I like to beat the crap out of that doesn't work anymore. It's really just an extension so I can hit the or strike the this side of the body of the CV joint and let it pop right out of there. So anyway, we got everything hanging. I went ahead and put a ratchet strap up to the frame here just to take the weight off this. You know, the brake line started to get a little tight, but you know, it's still loose now, and the axle's just kind of, you know, just kind of sitting in there nice. So should have enough room to pull that out now. Go do the other side. I'll try to do this holding the camera here. Again, you can use a punch with a wedge on the end of it to spread this a little bit, but then you just tap that upper control arm off of the steering knuckle or upper ball joint, whatever you want to call it. Again, I got the jack underneath here. I've got the bolts, the nuts rather, on the two outer studs of that shock removed. The stabilizer bar link is off. So right now, I'm just gonna let this jack loose here and let that whole assembly slowly come down. Watching my brake lines to make sure that they don't get too tight. Alright, at this point I'm going to need two hands. I got to help the shock down. I'll get right back with you. Okay, here's the driver's side. Once again, got it hooked up on the strut tower mount part of the frame up there, down to a lug nut, just to get the weight off of it, and again, so you don't make these brake lines too tight. Axle, same thing as the other side. I just came up through here with a extension and hit the back side of it. You see these axles, they just have a C-clip on the end of them. I don't know, this is going to probably really mess up here, but let me try to... That's C-clip on the end. So all you need to do is just get some momentum on this, just give it a nice shock, and out it pops. On to the next step. Alright, so here I am on the passenger side going to complete the next step, which is remove the inner drive shaft. Looks like on all data it's got a thread in here. So I put my inspection camera in here, and if you look at this screen here, see if I can move this forward for you. You can see in there, there's some threads. So I'm going to have to get a bolt. Boy, it would really be nice to have some threaded rod to put in there. I'm going to find a really long bolt to fit those threads and pull it out. Alright, so slight change in plan. I went ahead and pulled off the four-wheel drive actuator. It's just 3 bolts, 15 millimeter. You can see the shiny spots in the oil pan there. There's one up there kind of hidden by the transmission cooler lines, and then there's one right there. So anyway, pull that out, and then now I can really get to that shaft. Looking through the instructions, looks like they use a slide hammer. I'm going to just get a bolt in there and then try to hit it. I can't find my slide hammer. Try to hit it from the back side here. See, underneath here it's just sticking out. So anyway, you can throw a bolt in the end of here, let that bolt stick out that way a little bit, and then, you know, knock it that way and try to pull that shaft out. Alright, I got it out. Now you can see all the way to the diff. So the tunnel through the oil pan has no more obstruction. So I'll be moving to the driver's side of the vehicle to remove the diff. And there's that inner axle shaft. Let's put a bolt and some washers on the end of it. Put a ball joint or tie rod puller in between there and leveraged it and just popped it out. Alright, back on the driver's side, the main diff is going to come out now. So 18mm bolt here holding it to the oil pan. There's one up there. There's one right there. And then all the way in the back, a bolt right there. Pull those 4 bolts and get the diff off. Alright, there's the diff out. You can now see a line of sight to all of the oil pan bolts. Once I get this wiring harness out of the way, of course. What I didn't show you is there's a cross member back there that goes right across here. So it's 2 21mm bolts there, 2 21mm bolts there. I might have pointed wrong over here. It's these two guys right here. And then a couple of 15mm bolts, actually 4 of them, one there, and then on the other side. And then you can pop that whole cross member down. Makes it way easier to get to this this diff bolt here. And I'm leaving that bolt in there because once the diff is in its place, that bolt won't come out. Maybe I could have finagled it out, but didn't want to break anything. Just leave the bolt in there. That diff's going to just kind of rest on the frame there. I'll move back into the oil pan removal procedure, and we'll get the oil pan just straight down, replace the gasket straight back up, put the diff back against it. So that is the axle removal portion of this. Now I will go into the back into the oil pan removal procedure and get back with you on the next step. Alright, the next step was on the passenger side, was to remove the cooler lines bracket. There's a 13mm bolt right here. I already removed that when I was removing the electronic axle engagement piece on this passenger side. So that's already done. The next thing that I'm going to do, let's scoot back here, is remove this cross member here. Got 4 15mm bolts and get this cross member out of the way. That way I can clear the lip of this oil pan. I might also have to at least unbolt the steering rack and let it sink down a little bit to get the oil pan off. We'll get to that in a minute. But anyway, oil cooler lines or transmission cooler lines are unbolted from the oil pan on the passenger side. Remove this cross member, and then the next step is to remove the starter. If you have not done so and you skipped my step of disconnecting the negative battery cable, now is the time to do that because we're going to be pulling the starter off. Alright, old starter is out. You can see I got a brand new starter in there. You know, as an aside, while I was doing this job, the original starter was grinding every now and then. I mean, you don't have to replace the starter while you're doing this job, you just have to remove it. The reason you have to remove it is there's a plate that goes right here. It's a flywheel cover plate. It's plastic. Part of it goes around the starter for spacer, I'm guessing, and then it just bolts to the side of the oil pan right there with a 10mm bolt. Same thing on the other side. There's another plastic cover that's here that you have to remove that 10mm bolt there. So the next step is to get this front wiring harness off. So I'm going to unbolt it from the oil pan here. And I should be able to get to the rest of the front bolts after I do that. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that wiring harness off. I'm going to skip ahead and pull all of the oil pan bolts off. I'm going to see if I can't finagle this thing down with the steering rack still in place. I might have to unbolt the steering rack, but we'll see. Alright, I pulled all of the oil pan bolts out, and I realized that I forgot a step. So before you pull the bolts out, I'm going to do it with the bolts out, but I might put one back in, you know, loosely. You know, probably that hole right there, just put it back in the hole. You have to take the AC compressor bolts out, these bottom two. And the procedure also says loosen the top two, that way, you know, it can pull itself away from the pan a little bit. But anyway, yeah, that's important. Otherwise you'll break your oil pan. Bottom two AC compressor bolts out, top two loose. Here we go. Alright, there it is. Oil pan is out. I did end up having to lower the steering rack. You can see here, it's where it goes. So you don't have to take it all the way out, so you don't have to disconnect the shaft from the steering wheel. But you got to pull the two bolts out. I think it's 21mm, I don't even remember right now. Anyway, just two bolts there, and of course the other side. And then just pull the steering rack down a few inches, you know, it's like 2.5 inches or so down. And then you can get the oil pan out. The reason you got to do that is this pickup is got a spot in the oil pan where it goes, and the baffle plate is cut right here, just right, that it almost has to come straight down. So I could dip the front end of the oil pan to clear that, and then pull it forward towards the front of the car, and it came out. So anyway, next is I'm going to drill out that rivet and that rivet, and pull the old gasket off. They're riveted on from the factory, probably for ease of assembly. You don't have to rivet your new one on. Just drill those out, get rid of the old gasket, clean it up, and then I'll go over some steps putting this thing back together. Alright, got the oil pan back in. So did quite a few steps here. Before putting the oil pan in, make sure you put a dab of RTV on four corners, right where the timing cover meets the engine block, those two spots, and then back where the rear main seal cover meets the engine, underneath here, put a dab of RTV on both of those spots as well. So anyway, oil pan is back in, all nice and tight. The starter is back in, and now you can see the cover I was talking about earlier. And also the bolts for the bell housing are back in, and the bolts for the AC compressor are back in as well. And also the wiring harness. There's a 10mm bolt right here in front of the oil pan. That's back on as well. My next step will be to raise the steering rack right here back into position. After I do that, I will jack up the engine a little bit. I didn't show this earlier because it's really not part of the oil pan gasket replacement, but in order to get that starter out, it comes out through this hole here, and in order to clear this and the transmission bell housing, you actually got to undo the bolts from the motor mount and jack the engine up to get clearance. Anyway, so steering rack back up, jack the engine up, get the motor mount back through those holes, tighten it down. That'll be the next steps. Okay, once again, did lots of stuff here. Almost got moving too fast. I forgot to slow down and grab the camera and update you guys. Alright, so the steering rack is back up and in. Those 21mm nuts and bolts. Right after I did that, I decided that now is a good time to put the drive shaft back in. It's so much easier to put that in with this cross member removed, which I put that in too. So if the drive shaft's in, you know that the rear diff is on. So I put the steering rack up there and in, bolted the, I say rear diff, front diff back onto the oil pan, put the drive shaft on like I just mentioned, put this cross member back on right here, and put in the intermediate shaft through the hole in the oil pan, and then put on the four-wheel drive actuator on this side. This is a pretty hot tip here. You notice that the main cross member here is still missing. It is so much easier to get this on, and I imagine off, if this cross member is removed. So rewind back to when I went to take this off. Before you do that, take this cross member off, the two 21mm bolts, two 21mm bolts, a couple 15mm on each side, and that's it right there. And that's the cross member. That's what's going to go on next. So I'm going to get the cross member on, and then it's basically starting to put the drive shafts, the CV joints, back into the different sides of the front axle and bolting the suspension back together. Alright, putting the control arms, struts, etc. back together. I haven't put any of the lines back together yet as far as the AC and the brake lines. They're still loose in here, but I got this bolted up. So put a jack underneath the lower ball joint. And then you're going to have to watch a bunch of things at one time. As you jack this up, you've got to see, I got that axle in there now. There's that C-clip. So there's also a seal there, and you don't want to hurt that seal. So as you're jacking it up very slowly, like, you know, do one or two pumps and take a look, one or two pumps, take a look. You got to be lining up this axle hole and those two bolt holes almost at the same time. This really doesn't matter that much. You can get that on later, but make sure that axle is going into the splines, and then you basically, once you get it started in the splines, I just took the spindle piece here, pushed it forward, and then with my left hand and then with my right hand just push that axle in so I could hear the C-clip clip in there. Just take your time. It all makes sense when you do it. You got to play with it. Make sure that your sway bar is on top of the lower control arm. I accidentally started putting it up and this sway bar was pointed down. Somewhere in the process it had rotated down. I got to get new sway bar links. When I took the ones off earlier, it snapped on me. It was old and rusted, so I got new ones of those coming. But anyway, make sure that sway bar is on top of that lower control arm. And again, just go slow. Couple pumps with the jack, take a look. Couple pumps with the jack, take a look, and slowly get her all in there. All right, now here's the driver's side. So once again, you just get a jack, put it underneath the lower ball joint, start jacking it up, I found that if you line up the top holes of the strut into the frame tower portion here, just get the bolts sticking through just a little bit up here, and stop and put a few threads on there just to hold it. Then what I did to get the CV shaft in there and clipped on, you can see it's in there, the C-clip's holding it. I just put my shoulder right here and pushed inward towards the vehicle while using both hands to kind of guide this. You know, there's a seal in there that you don't want to mess up. So just on my knees, put my right shoulder here and push the spindle inward while guiding this shaft in, and it clipped right in. Got all the lines bolted back down. The brake line is bolted on here. This bolt was stripped out. You probably saw that at the beginning of this video. So that's just a new bolt all the way through there with a nut on the end. And then of course the ABS wheel sensor lines clipped back in, brake line, 10mm bolt back on. Same thing on the passenger side. Just the same thing. Of course, this side, I don't have a stabilizer, sway bar link either. Those are on order. I've got other vehicles to drive until those get in, and that'll be real easy just to slap on real quick once those come in. And don't forget to put your vent hose back on. Here it is, right here. Just find it wherever it was laying down in here, and feed it back into that clip it down. And last but not least here, get the dipstick back in. As I was putting the oil pan in, you know, I'm kind of feeding the tube into that hole to make sure it's all nice and at least lined up to go in. You just take the tube here, push down, you can feel it pop in. There's an O-ring that seals it down there. And then it's bolt right there. Kind of hard to get to, but you know, not too terribly difficult. Alright, some of the last steps here. Don't forget your fluids. Remember, on the first couple steps here, we drained both the oil, of course, and the front differential. So I've already put oil in it and, you know, changed the filter. You can see that down there on the ground. This is the gearbox fill. You can see in here that plug is a 18mm head on there. You can fill this multiple ways. You can get a pump and pump it in. This is how I prefer to do it, is just to use gravity. I just got a tie-on tube here hooked to my funnel. I'll be putting in 75 and 90 synthetic. That's what the book calls for fluid in these differentials. So anyway, another trick you could do is you can put this in the oven for a little while or out in the sunlight and heat it up, and flows much easier. It's fairly warm here this morning. I'm in Arizona, so I'm just going to go ahead and fill this sucker up. You'll know it's full once you see a little bit of fluid dripping out of that fill hole. Here we go. Alright, all I did was just took the negative battery cable back up, made sure the oil cap's on, dipstick's in, put the fill plug back in on the differential, fired it up, and I'm just going to let it sit here and run for a while, double check everything, make sure I got no leaks. If I do, I'm going to just burn it. This is really a pretty serious job. This video is not meant for your average home mechanic just doing oil changes. Pretty involved. So if you're a pretty good mechanic and you've done a lot of things and you feel confident, this really was just a video of a step-through process if you've never worked on one of these before on how to do this oil pan gasket. Anyway, thanks for watching. Hopefully I caught everything. If not, hopefully everything is obvious. Literally the last thing I've got to do is just put the plastic belly pan back on. I have it off right now, one because As I was filling the axle, I knew it was going to drip out onto that pan and cause a mess. And 2, because I want to see the oil pan. I want to feel it get warm and you know, get down there and inspect and make sure everything's good. But once again, thanks for watching. Subscribe and like.